What would happen if the most emblematic car in the history of Formula One was hiding a failure that could cost the championship? After the Singapore GP, Ferrari was naked, and not only for his track mistakes. What was discovered within the SF25 of Lewis Hamilton could be the most serious technical scandal from the Spygate. What exactly is what they are trying to hide in Maranello? What happened in the 2025 Grand Prix was much more than a bad weekend for Ferrari. It was the culmination of a chain of silent failures, hidden errors, and internal tensions that exploded publicly at the least indicated moment. Marina Bay, with her low-speed urban layout, a demanding and Vasseur in the physical, became the perfect scenario so that everything Ferrari had tried to hide for months came to light with brutal forcefulness. From the first free training there were already worrying signs. The SF25 of Lewis Hamilton could not enter the optimal operating window of the tires. The car was unstable when braking, difficult to trace in slow curves, and the most alarming, lost return after return without clear explanation. The team opted for silence. Nothing communicated to the press. They limited themselves to minor adjustments that did not address the underlying problem. But within the box, the atmosphere was of growing frustration. During the classification, the problems were aggravated. Hamilton, with a trajectory recognized for its ability to squeeze every thousandth in decisive turns, simply could not generate confidence in the car. Its radius at the end of Q3 was more than eloquent, a combination of technical impotence and content. The phrase he pronounced, "I can't stop the car, the brakes don't work, the pedal is on the floor," it was not a simple complaint. It was a technical scream for reporting reported. In Formula One, that a 7-time world champion reaches that point of despair is, in itself, a scandal. The situation became unsustainable during the race. Hamilton lost rhythm dramatically in the second stint, falling positions despite the fact that in theory the SF25 had been optimized for urban paths like Singapore. But the degradation of the tires, the inability to maintain temperature, and the feeling of lack of technical direction by the team created an explosive cocktail. In a team that should have each parameter under control, the car seemed improvised, as if the engineers no longer knew how to interpret the data that came in real time. At the end of the race, Ferrari could no longer hide. The journalists began to ask. The rumors intensified. The FIA technicians checked the car more detail, and what they discovered was even worse than expected. Deformations in the flat background that altered the aerodynamic load and compromised the balance of the car. The true bomb was not that Ferrari had a little competitive car. It was that they had known it for weeks, perhaps from the Australian GP, and had chosen to shut up. They had exposed their pilots, and in particular to their new star signing, to a work environment that bordered the dysfunctional. Hamilton, far from emotional or explosive, chose another way, the surgical precision of his statements. Compared Ferrari's chaos with the structure of Mercedes. He didn't do it to find an emotional reaction. He did it as warning. He said what no one dared to say publicly within Maranello. His words were careful, as if he were writing the first chapter of an internal report. And that was the clearest sign that, in Singapore, it was not simply a car that failed. It was an entire structure that collapsed under the weight of its own omissions. Singapore was the catalyst, but the scandal had been fermenting long before. The problem was not only technical. It was cultural. It was organizational. And what happened under the spotlights of Marina Bay was only the beginning of the true drama that is coming for Ferrari if they do not act quickly and transparency. Because when the most successful pilot in the modern history of F1 begins to lose confidence in his team in public, the countdown has already begun. And all in the paddock know it. The technical problem of the SF25 cannot be understood only as a punctual breakdown or an aerodynamic misinterpretation. What was discovered after the Singapore GP was the confirmation that Ferrari had built a car that suffered from a severe structural defect, deeply rooted in one of the most critical elements of the current era of Formula One, the floor of the car. Since the implementation of soil effect regulations in 2022, this area has become the epicenter of performance. If the ground does not work correctly, the car not only loses aerodynamic efficiency, but becomes an unpredictable, unstable, and worst, dangerous for the pilot. The anomaly that affected the SF25 was directly related to the way in which the flat background responded to the changes of march height. When the car passed through pianos, cargo areas, or strong braking, flexion was not produced in a controlled manner. In simple terms, the flat background suffered non-linear deformations, which drastically altered the airflow under the car. This not only reduced aerodynamic load, but made it variable and inconsistent between curves and circuit areas. The car could have a good grip in a curve and lose it completely in the following, without apparent reason from the pilot's perspective. This phenomenon generated what engineers call stable platform loss. In the simulators, the SF-25 showed a stable and competitive behavior. But on the track, with all the dynamic variables at stake, the car behaved as if it had two personalities. One in lines, another in curves, one in moderate lateral load, and a completely different one under maximum pressure. This type of inconsistencies are lethal in Formula One, where the pilot's confidence in car behavior is essential to squeeze performance. The most visible symptom of this technical problem was the impossibility of maintaining the optimal temperature in the tires. The sudden loss of between 5 and 6 degrees, just before a quick lap, not only frustrated Hamilton classification attempts, but also showed that SF-25 was unable to generate the necessary energy to keep the rubber alive. The compound, not being within its thermal window, offered less adhesion, less traction, and consequently forced the pilot to overcome, which in turn generated more errors and premature wear of the car. To this drama, an additional problem was added: the brake system. Hamilton reported that the brake pedal was completely sank, without offering resistance or real deceleration. This is one of the most dangerous situations that a pilot can live in the race. Ferrari tried to justify it as a combination of thermal factors and wear, but the reality is that this fault showed poor management of the auxiliary systems of the car. In an urban circuit like Marina Bay, where brakes are constantly used in extreme conditions, not having a 100% reliable system is simply unacceptable. Ferrari engineers, after reviewing the data, detected that the distribution of heat between the brake system and the tires was unbalanced. Instead of transferring heat to the tires to help them enter the ideal temperature window, the system seemed to be isolated, dissipating energy without any functional benefit. This lack of synergy between brakes and tires is another indication that the car design was thought with erroneous assumptions or did not adapt correctly to the real conditions of the circuit. The consequence of all this was that Hamilton not only fought against his rivals on the track, he fought against his own car. Each curve was an uncertain exercise, every return a failed experiment, and each stint a controlled torture. What should be a competitive weapon became a structural limitation. And the most disturbing of all is that Ferrari knew about these problems from previous careers. The SF-25 had been showing these signs from Melbourne, but instead of acting forcefully, the team opted for minor adjustments, waiting for the symptoms to disappear on their own. These types of decisions are not just technical errors. They are signs of an organizational culture that has not yet managed to learn from its previous falls. When a team allows such a critical failure to remain hidden from several races, it is assuming a risk that does not correspond to a contender to the title. And when that fault directly affects the pilot's ability to compete in equal conditions, it is no longer just a technique. This is responsibility, a vision, leadership. In summary, the SF-25 is a car with a structural failure invisible to the naked eye, but devastating in its effects. And its presence on the track, without correction, is a stain in the technical credibility of Ferrari that will have consequences in both its future performance and in the confidence of its own pilots. Especially of a Lewis Hamilton that is not accustomed to this type of improvisations. The fracture within Ferrari after the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix was not simply a difference in opinions or passenger tension. What was lived was the collapse of a facade that the team had maintained with effort since the beginning of the season. The Italian team, historically accustomed to dealing with media pressure and internal criticism, entered a spiral that this time could not contain. The conflict between his two pilots and the coaching staff became so evident that any attempt to hide it was useless. Understanding why Ferrari decided to hide for so long the structural problems of SF-25 requires analyzing not only the technical aspects, but the internal dynamics of power, communication, and strategy that have defined the Scuderia in recent years. The decision to silence such a critical failure was not impulsive or accidental. It was a deliberate choice, born of fear, media pressure, and an institutional culture that historically has preferred to protect its image rather than confront its weaknesses. Because accepting that fault publicly involved recognizing that the SF-25 project in which millions had invested and on which they had built a resurgence narrative was committed since their conception. And that, for a brand like Ferrari, was politically unacceptable. The pressure of the Italian media environment, the high expectation for the arrival of Lewis Hamilton, and the need to maintain internal morals afloat, led the technical managers and the directive dome to hide the problem under the carpet. Leave me your opinion in the comments you think.